Today we are reading the last chapter of book 1 from Sun. This is going to end on a little bit of a cliffhanger, and we're going to see what happens to Claire. We know that she does not steal Abe or Gabe and save him from being released because we know Jonas does that. So what actually happens to Claire? Where does she go? Why did we not see her in The Giver? All will be revealed today in our chapter 16 of Sun. So you can play this video and follow along. And while you're watching, please make sure you're filling in your reading log for chapter 16. This chapter chunk was 12 to 16. So you should have content for chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 color-coded at the end of the period today. Okay, here we go. Chapter 16. The supply boat was once again moored by the hatchery. Its ropes had been looped over the posts and its slanted gangplank slid ashore. Recalling the delay they had suffered a year ago, this time they arrived early and would be leaving before the coming 2-day event prevented their departure. The time of the ceremony was fast approaching. Had it really been that long? Had she been here at the hatchery for well over a year? It was hard to believe. But when she thought of the child, of little Abe, she was aware of how he had developed from an infant wailing for a bottle when she first encountered him into a giggly toddler who could say her name, wave bye-bye, and imitate the funny face they now made to each other as a greeting that made them both laugh. Hearing her coworkers mention the upcoming ceremony reminded her that Abe would be assigned this time. He would move to a dwelling, have a set of parents, and perhaps an older sibling. She would have to find a new way of continuing their relationship. Of course, his new female parent, Claire could not make herself think mother, would have a job in the community as well, as all women did. So the child would go to the child care center each day. Claire had done volunteer work there when she was young and fulfilling her required hours. She had enjoyed that time and knew that Abe would be well cared for there. He would be given educational toys, fed a balanced diet fortified with vitamins, taken for walks in the big multi-child stroller, and introduced to basic discipline, the meaning of no and don't, how he must not suck his thumb, though he would be permitted to stroke his comfort object if he needed soothing. He would be tucked into a crib at nap time when the big room's lights were dimmed. Thinking of the nap time ritual, Claire felt a little concerned. Abe still was not a good sleeper. Most toddlers in the child care center responded to firm discipline and learned quickly to be silent when the lights were dimmed. She remembered the rows of cribs, with most of the little occupants sound asleep, and those who were wakefully staring quietly at the ceiling. The small children had names by then, and she recalled walking along the row and reading Liam, Slavana, Barbara, Henrik on the identifying cards. Soon after the upcoming ceremony, he would be officially Abe. She desperately hoped that the crib with his name on it would not contain a wailing, sleepless little boy who would toss his hippo to the floor and thumb his feet rhythmically against the mattress. Shrieking and kicking, sometimes holding his breath until his face turned frighteningly dark, was what he was still doing at the nurturing center at nap time. Whatever would they do with such a child when he entered the child care system? Failure to thrive? They wrote on his chart when he was very young. Now, failure to adjust? She shuddered. There were very severe consequences in the community for a citizen who couldn't adjust. Surely they would be more lenient with a very small boy, Claire thought, but she wasn't certain. It made her nervous to think about. She rode over to visit one afternoon, 2 days before the ceremony, and could see the cleanup crews working hard outside the auditorium, obviously preparing for the one time each year when the community gathered. Claire would attend this year. Already, they had assigned a different worker to remain at the hatchery. It was important to her to see Abe assigned, to know where he would be next. Maybe since the assignments were so close, she could sneak a look at the paperwork. Sometimes there was a clipboard on the nurturer's desk. Perhaps the information was there. But when Claire arrived at the nurturing center, she could feel immediately that something was wrong. Of course, she thought, they're all very busy because of the ceremony plans. They have to prepare these children, all 50, for new families. A letter would have to accompany each new child, a letter with instructions for the parental unit, feeding information, schedules, discipline reminders, health data, and observations about personality. Of course, the staff was preoccupied and distracted. It accounted, Claire thought, for the heightened tension she felt. The nurturer, who had always been so pleasant to her, the one with a son named Jonas who took Abe to his dwelling at night, was oddly abrupt when she greeted him. He seemed angry. She could hear a muttered argument taking place in a corner. No one smiled at her. Even more distressingly, when she went to pick up Abe, who was playing with a wooden toy on the floor, someone snatched him away. Not a good idea to play with this one, a uniformed female worker said. There's one over there. That girl, she needs to be changed. You could do that if you want to be helpful. The woman stalked off, holding Abe. She plopped him into an empty crib, and he began to howl immediately. Everyone ignored him. I could maybe quiet him down, Claire suggested, and you'd be able to get your work done more easily. Leave him, the woman commanded her. Claire looked questioningly at the nurturer, whom she had begun to think of as a friend. She realized suddenly that in all these moments she had never asked his name. But clearly now was not the time. His face was set in hard lines and he looked away. But I said, leave him, the woman repeated impatiently. Claire wanted to argue, perceived that she must not, and fell silent. Dutifully, she picked up the baby girl they had indicated and took her to the changing table. In the background, Abe screamed and kicked at the bars of the crib. No one moved towards him. Claire cleaned and diapered the cheerful female and set her back down with her toys on the floor. Other babies crawled and played nonchalantly as if they were accustomed to the shrieking boy in the crib. At the desk, the nurturer, whose name she had never thought to learn, the one who Claire knew cared about Abe, suddenly slammed shut the reader-writer device he'd been working on. He stood. He looked at the clock on the wall. I'm leaving early, he said. Excuse me? The uniformed woman looked up. She seemed to have some authority. I have a headache, the nurturer said. The woman glanced at the communication system on the wall. You can call for medication, she pointed out. The nurturer ignored her. He went over to the crib and picked up Abe, who was clutching his comfort object and still shuddering with sobs, though his shrieking had subsided. I'll take him with me now. You know he spends the nights in my dwelling. No need, she said sharply. He might as well stay here tonight. What's the point? The point is that my family is fond of him, and I would like to have him with us this evening. He was speaking firmly to her, and Claire could see that she was trying to decide whether to argue. When she turned back to the papers in her hand, it was clear that she had decided against any confrontation. Return him early tomorrow, she said. It sounded like an order. I will. He walked toward the door, the toddler in his arms, and then spoke to Claire. Do you have your bike? Why don't you ride part way with us? You can turn off to the hatchery at the main road. Confused, Claire nodded to the woman, who ignored her and followed the man and Abe. She waited to watch him pack the hippo into the carrying case, then strapped the child in the back of the bike seat and mounted her own bicycle and rode beside him on the path. He didn't speak. The baby glanced at her, smiling now. She lifted one hand from the handle grip, waved to him, and watched him wave back. Both bikes slowed at the intersection where Claire would turn to the right. They stopped. Maybe I'll see you tomorrow, she said uncertainly. I know you have a lot of work because of the ceremony, but... He interrupted her. I know you didn't attend last year, he said. Do you plan to go to this one? Claire nodded. I especially want to see Abe get his assigned family. The man hesitated, then told her, they're not assigning him, and no more extensions either. They've run out of patience with him. They voted today. Behind him, the child began to churn his legs. He wanted the bike to start up again. But what then? Where will he? The man shrugged. You should say goodbye now. He'll be sent on his way in the morning. On his way where? The child had heard the word goodbye. He opened and closed his chubby hand toward Claire. Bye-bye, he said. Bye-bye. Then he thrust his tongue into his cheek and made their secret funny face with his creased forehead and wrinkled nose. Claire tried hard to make the face back to him, but it was difficult. She was breathing hard and could feel tears rising hotly behind her eyes. Where? She asked again. But the man simply shook his head. It seemed to Claire that he was unable to speak, that his breath was coming quickly as well. Then he gathered himself and said offhandedly, "It's just the way it is. It's for the best. It's the way the system works. And by the way, you have his name wrong. It's not Abe." "Ready, little guy?" he asked, swiveling his head to check on his passenger. "Off we go." He started forward. Some pebbles spat from the path and stung Claire's ankle. Stunned, she watched the bicycle set off across the path that led to the family dwellings. Years later, many years later, when Claire tried to piece together memories of her last days in the community, the last things that she could see whole and clear were the bicycle moving away and the back of the child's head. The rest of the hours that followed were fragments, like bits of shattered glass. No matter how hard she tried to piece them together, she could never create it whole and unblemished. She remembered that the cargo boat was still docked. It was loading. They were rushing for some reason. She had heard someone call to another about weather concerns, a phrase she didn't understand. There were the usual complicated sounds of the departure preparations, whistles and shouts, the thump of the crates being stacked. But then night came and went, and the boat had not left. Something had happened in the night. There were alarm bells. In the hatchery, something was wrong in the lab. No, not there. The boat? Were the alarms from the boat? No, farther away, from the main building? And from the speakers in each room, loud announcements waking everyone. But why? What had gone wrong? It was morning now, in her memory. The boat crew had been preparing to cast off the ropes and leave, but they were delayed. Time had passed. Usually the boat was there so briefly, but this time it was longer. Something delayed the boat's departure. Everyone was looking for something. Someone? Yes, it was that someone was missing. Searchers came and looked along the riverbank throughout the day. Then it was dark again. Even at night, they searched with flashlights. They shouted. She remembered strangely that the nurturer had been standing on the path. Why was he there? She had never seen him there before. Now he stood there but didn't acknowledge Claire, didn't look at her. He was looking at the river. He was calling a name. Jonas! Jonas! His son, yes, that was his son. So it was his son who had gone missing. Piecing together the fragments of memory, Claire could feel the cold dirt of the path under her bare feet. Why would she have been barefoot? Everyone always wore shoes and running. Why had she been running? Now the nurturer spoke to her loudly, but what had he said? He took him. Jonas took the babe. Was that what he had shouted to her? Elsewhere, elsewhere. Well, what did that mean? Then, through the blurred confusion of the memory, she found that she was on the boat. She had run up the slanted plank in her bare feet, crying. The heavy-set woman, her light hair unpinned, came from the cabin and put out her arms to Claire. She remembered the feeling of enfolding, the smells, sweat, and onions from the woman, fuel and damp wood from the boat itself. A puff of smoke, the scrape of the plank being pulled aboard. She was with them on the boat. The engine throbbed. They were leaving. Why was she, Claire, on the boat? They were headed elsewhere. They said they would help her find the boy and the baby. My son, she had told them, sobbing. Next, her blurred memory was of the sea, which she had never seen before. Rain, something she had never felt. Storm, lightning, waves, fear. The men were shouting. She was in the way. They shoved her aside and rushed to tie things down. She couldn't stand. It was wet and slippery. Even inside the cabin, she fell, sprawled on the floor. She heard things slide loose and break. She felt a rush of water. Suddenly, it pulled at her clothing, cold, so cold, and then quiet. A hollow, rushing kind of quiet. Darkness. And that was all Claire remembered of those last days, no matter how hard she tried over the hard and lonely years that followed. Wow, what a chapter. Okay, so the ending here is really interesting because it's pieces, fragmented pieces of Claire's memory. So, what do we know from chapter 16? We just learned that all of this, book one, was Claire thinking back on her past. So, Claire has a fuzzy memory about what happened at the end there, her last days in the community. So she learns that her son Abe is going to be released, and she doesn't remember what happens after. She remembers that Jonas's father was biking away on the path and that her son was, behind him, and then that's it. So we know, because we read The Giver, that Jonas takes Gabe and leaves. And so this is kind of cool because we see a snippet of what happens in the community after Jonas leaves. So they are announcing that someone is missing. They have his name going out on the speakers. Everyone's searching for him. We see Jonas's father looking out to the ocean, wondering where he is, screaming his name. And then we see Claire make the decision. She's crying. She's barefoot. She doesn't understand why. She makes the decision to go out there after her son, wherever he is. And so she runs onto the boat. Marie is there. Marie holds her. She says, "My son, I have to find my son." They're going to help her. They go out into the ocean. There's a storm. The storm is rocking the boat. Things are sliding loose. Things are breaking apart. And so the boat is broken apart. Claire is in the water at the very end, and there's darkness, and then she's drifting out into the ocean. And that's where chapter 16 leaves us. So now we have Jonas out there with the baby. Claire has gone after them. She is floating out in the ocean by herself. And so we don't know where she's going to end up. So we're going to see in book 2 pretty soon here that she's going to end up in a brand new world, a brand new community, and things are very, very different than what we saw so far. So in terms of plot highlights for chapter 16, Claire learns that her son is going to be released. We see Jonas's father getting emotional about it. He leaves and tells her to go with him so they can talk. Jonas's father tells Claire to say goodbye. This is her last chance to say goodbye. And then we get fragmented pieces of her memory. She knows that Jonas disappears. Her son is gone. She wants to go after them. She gets on the boat and it breaks apart and she's left floating in the ocean. In terms of impactful lines, there's lots to choose from here. I think that the piece where Jonas's father tells her to say goodbye is wonderful because it shows that he cares enough to involve her in like a little sentimental moment before he's gone forever, which is terrible. But Jonas's father cares enough and knows that Claire cares enough that they need that special moment. I definitely think the ending there where there's darkness and she's floating out in the ocean by herself is an impactful line because now we're left on a cliffhanger. What happens to Claire? Character development is kind of interesting because we saw from chapters 14 and 15 that Claire was ready to take on the community. She was ready to, she said she would rather die than give up the love that she felt for her son. And if someone of authority came to her and told her she had to take these pills to remove her emotion, that she was going to fight them. And so we saw this really rebellious Claire in chapters 14 and 15. And then here in 16, she kind of loses that and she falls apart when she finds out that her son is going to be released, which I'm left a little bit disappointed with her there. I feel like she could have maybe done something a little bit more in that moment where Jonas's father is with her son and they're out there with him on the bike. She doesn't really do anything. She kind of just watches him leave. But then, of course, we see toward the end with those fragmented memories that she's developed into someone who is ready for an adventure, ready to leave, ready to go after what she wants. And she is now no longer a member of this community from book 1, The Giver. So that's some character development. Next up on our reading log, we have here. Core conflicts. So core conflict, and you're filling out, just to be clear, this reading log here, and we're doing our chapter chunk of 12 to 16. Core conflicts. the main conflict that we see at the end here is the conflict that Claire's memory is kind of fragmented, and we're going to see her struggle with her memory here in book 2. She's not going to remember anything at first until she starts having some experiences and making connections between things that are happening now and then things that happened in the past. So for core conflicts, I would say the fragmented memory, her losing pieces of her memory would be a conflict. Obviously, we have the giant conflict of Gabe almost being released. So that's big. And then another conflict is that she's going after her son. Think of this. She's going after her son, but does she even know his name? Right? She thinks his name is Abe. We know that it's Gabriel. So how are you possibly going to find someone and you don't even know that person's name? It's going to be very difficult. So that would be a core conflict. For questions I have, one of the questions that I have is, why didn't she really do more when she found out what was happening? Why did she kind of just let Jonas's father ride away on the bike path and kind of accept that? I think she was kind of just in shock, so she didn't really know what to do. So that was a question I have. And then obviously the next question, the huge question, where is she? She's out in the ocean. She's floating away. It's dark. It's cold. She's by herself. Is Claire going to survive this? Where is Claire going to end up? Is she going to be able to find her son without knowing his name? There's so many questions. So you could really pack that questions box on your reading log. And then for insights, have any of your predictions been correct? So in this last section here, insight, I think that here's where you should be thinking about how you predicted Claire would react to things and what actually happened. So have your predictions been close? Were they not close? And then maybe for insight too, make a prediction of what you think will happen next. Is Claire going to reconnect with Jonas? We know that Claire knows who Jonas is. She knows his name. She knows his face. Jonas, on the flip side, does he know Claire? We don't really know. That's kind of unclear. So for insight, do you think Claire will be able to find Jonas? And do you think Jonas, if they do meet up, will accept Claire for who she is? Will he believe that this is Gabe's mom? It might be kind of hard to believe, especially coming from a community where no one has emotions or no one's supposed to have emotions. It might be hard for Jonas to accept that someone would leave the community in search of their son when there is no really maternal love in the community. So that's something to think about. So what you're going to do is you are going to finish up your reading log. You're going to pack it with a lot of good information here. And then you're submitting your reading log today for chapters 12 through 16. So stay tuned. And I can't wait to read with you the beginning of book 2 because it's fantastic. Wait until you see what happens to Claire. Right now, she's out there just floating in the ocean after a storm. So stay tuned and have fun with your reading log.